Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Wardian. I am a current board member and former president of Outdoor Research. I recently took on the role of president and chief strategy officer for Youngwon Corporation, which is the parent company of Outdoor Research and is based in Seoul, South Korea. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm tuning in from Chelan, Washington, the ancestral lands of the Nukla Pomuk, which has the third deepest lake in the United States at almost 1,500 feet. During this segment, we'd love for all of you attending to introduce yourself via the chat and the ancestral lands that you are tuning in from. As we get started, I'd like to thank the sponsors and organizers who made this possible. This includes the organizers of Teresa Baker, Jam Collective, and Ravel Media. Our title sponsor is Backcountry, and supporting sponsors are Arc'teryx, Merrill, Outdoor Research, Patagonia, and Smartwool. This event is free thanks to the support of our generous sponsors, and all proceeds from sponsorships are being donated to the Carolyn Project, committed to expanding outdoor access for girls and young women by supporting community-based wilderness and outdoor education groups. Before we get started, we'd like to review some community guidelines that we've established as a team for the duration of this event. We strive for this virtual gathering to be a safer, more inclusive space. The summit centers on the experiences of cis and trans women, as well as people who have experienced gender discrimination in their outdoor professional and personal lives. We welcome all people who are comfortable in a space that centers on the experience of women. While this event is called the Women's Outdoor Summit, our attendees may not all be women. We require our community to use pronouns that are shared by the speakers and attendees. We encourage all to practice gender-neutral language and avoid generalizations about the bodies and experiences of the community. We encourage respectful interaction and community engagement. If something resonates with you or you have a question, comments will be viewable by facilitators to address in real time. When sharing our perspectives, we agree to be curious and ask questions before making judgments, and to communicate in ways that allow everyone to feel seen, valued, and heard. We will maintain civil dialogue between speakers and listeners, and we will not tolerate any form of harassment, including racism, ableism, saneism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, sexism, body shaming, etc., and harmful comments will be removed. We encourage you to do what you need today to be present with us. This may look like turning off other distractions, preparing yourself with a snack, taking breaks between sessions, or whatever helps you get the most out of this experience. We are here to learn and connect with one another, reflect on how our experiences align or differ, and to celebrate joy together. We are also thrilled to be able to offer ASL interpreting throughout the duration of the summit, and we're happy to host a time of moderated question and answer at the end of each session, where we will address any questions posed in the comments. So please feel free to engage in the comments throughout the session. Just quickly, I'd like to share why this event is so important to Outdoor Research and why we chose to support it. This conference is not only about bringing people together, but it will continue to build trust and a sense of belonging that most people feel they need to be safe in the outdoor spaces. And we need to expand the definition of that. Outdoor Research is part of this event so we can learn from you, through you, how do we get curious? How do we transform? How do we learn? This event is another step forward in the evolution of how this industry does business in a whole new way. So let's keep going. I'd now like to introduce Jalen Goff, founder of Native Women's Wilderness, who will facilitate land acknowledgements.
Thank you, Michelle. Yat she Jalen Yenaba Goff Yenishne. Good morning. Well, I guess it's still morning in Boulder. It might not be morning there. My name is Jalen Yenaba Goff, and I am the founder of Native Women's Wilderness, and it was created out of the frustration of the lack of Native women and two spirits represented in the outdoor industry. And I am Dene, which is Navajo, and I am currently living in Boulder, Colorado, which is the stolen lands of Arapaho, Ute, Cheyenne, and Shoshone. And I put in Cheyenne and Shoshone because, especially around here with the mountain areas, this was like the seasons of grazing, you know, when you leave the mountains for the winter and then when you come back during the summer. So really honoring all tribes who have considered this home throughout the seasons. I am from Gallup, New Mexico, from the Navajo Reservation, and we call that land Diné-Bikéyah. And one of the reasons why I like doing land acknowledgements and why I encourage others to do land acknowledgements is to get down to the root of the honoring, right? Of the honoring of the tribes, of the people, the language, and the traditions. And I think lately it's become really bougie to like do land acknowledgements. And so I encourage you to take it one step further of understanding the people that you're speaking of, right? A lot of the tribes have colonizer names. So my tribe's name is the Navajo, but we call ourselves Diné, which means the people. And so if you take that one step further in learning what they call themselves, right? Or maybe even going beyond that of learning what they call their land, which is ours is Diné-Bikéyah. And I think that's really important because the outdoor industry has gleaned billions of dollars off of stolen land. And I'm really frustrated, and I really wonder what it would look like if these brands and the companies, how much they would give back to the Native communities, not just organizations, but to actual communities, because many tribal members live on reservations that we were forced to live on. And a lot of the reservations look like third world countries. I think of Pine Ridge. I think of my own res where, they have no plumbing, they have no electricity. And so giving back to these people that were shoved onto reservations, I think would be a really amazing feat. So if you're an organizer, or if you're a CEO or whatnot for your brand or for your company, I would really implore you to think about what that would look for your company. What would it look like to bring in marketing of Native people, to bring in land acknowledgement, and bring in marketing of whose land are you exploring on, or who the stolen lands, right? Because for many Native people, it's not just about being outside. This isn't a recreational sport. We're not out there to bag that peak or to send that route. But there's a spiritual connection with us. We honor the land. We are the water and land protectors. And so we go out to the land to communicate and to gain healing. For example, one place that I go to a lot is Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. And it's the place where the big genocide for my people started, which was the Long Walk. And, I go there to gain healing, but I also go there to bring strength to myself, because I see it as if my ancestors were able to survive that and come back to Diné-Bikéyah. Then at this point in my life, I know that they're giving me the strength that they got through, and I know I can make it through this point, or this hard situation. And so I really encourage you to do the research that you're on. So for example, in Boulder, Colorado, there's the Sand Creek Massacre that is just south of Denver, that was started by the Colorado governor, Evans, which now 14er is named after him. So finding the history and learning about this of how horrible is it that this governor who started the Sand Creek Massacre was honored now with a massive mountain to be named after him. And then also figuring out the name of the tribe and what they call themselves, not what the colonizers have given them. So our name is Navajo. That's, what we were colonized into, but we call ourselves Diné, which means the people. We call our land Diné-Bikéyah. And I think that would be a really beautiful an extra step to learn that information. So I really want to read you a quote from Braiding Sweetgrass. I know I've been kind of doing that throughout the session. I think it's a really beautiful book, and I really encourage you to, also take that book in hand and read through it and really think about what I said about how do we reconnect to the land, but also how do we honor the people who came before us, right? How do we honor the tribes that are on reservations and who are water and land protectors? So the most important thing each of us can know is our unique gift and how to use it in the world. Individuality is cherished and nurtured because in order for the whole to flourish, each of us has to be strong in who we are and carry our gifts with conviction so they can be shared with each other. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you can show us what your gift is. And I'm really excited to hear Dr. Finney and to share her gifts with us. And so thank you.
Okay, so this is amazing. I get to introduce you all today to Dr. Carolyn Finney, whose superpower is as a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer. The aim of her work is to develop greater cultural competency within environmental organizations and institutions, challenge media outlets on their representation of difference, and increase awareness of how privilege shapes who gets to speak to environmental issues and determine policy and action. Now, this is good. Carolyn is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA and MA. Both of these degrees focused on gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, respectively, and a PhD, which focused on African Americans and environmental issues in the United States. She has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Cannon National Park Science Scholar, and received a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship in Environmental Studies. Carolyn has worked with the media in various capacities, including The Travis Smiley Show, MSNBC, and Vice News Tonight, wrote op-eds for Outside Magazine and Newsweek, and was a guest editor and contributor for a special section on race and the national park in Orion Magazine, participated in a roundtable conversation with REI and The Atlantic, interviewed with various media outlets including NPR, Sierra Club, Boston Globe, National Geographic, and even filmed a commercial for Toyota that had highlighted the importance of African Americans getting out into nature. Along with public speaking, writing, consulting, and teaching, she has held positions at Wellesley College, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Kentucky. She served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, which assists the National Park Service in engaging in relations of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. And without further ado, here she is.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Once again, everyone is in my apartment in Burlington, Vermont. And so my first shout out is to the traditional peoples, the Abenaki people here in Burlington, the traditional lands of the Abenaki people. I've been saying Abenaki for so long and just realized I've been saying it the wrong way. So I'm practicing trying to get it right. I want to thank everybody for being here today, but let me start with my sister comrade, Teresa Baker, for asking me to add my voice. Whenever Teresa asks me to do something, I'm going to say yes. So I'm happy to be here. I want to shout out to everyone else, folks I've just met today, as well as everyone else I know behind the scenes who's making this space possible. When I was putting my thank yous together, I realized I also want to shout out and thank a number of women who I've come to know who've influenced the way that I think about my work, but who are no longer with us in body. Iantha Gant Wright, Maveen Betch, Brenda Lansendorf, Leola McCoy, and Frances Hodges. What I wrote here was, they are no longer with us in body, but whose spirit I owe a debt. I think all of them were using what my friend, writer, and educator Priscilla Ibarra would call tools of audacity to make right the world. All right. And so I'm always trying to hold that in a particular way and find out what is that for myself and what is that for us. And I know they're watching us right now, so we better come correct. Okay, so I usually at this point I put up slides and I'm so used to doing that, but I'm not doing that now. It's just going to be my face and occasionally looking down to keep myself right. So I was coming to today thinking I've got 30 minutes to say some things. And so I called this state of mind. And whenever I'm unsure of what I want to say or how I want to say it, the thing from those of you who know me that I know for sure is that I want to come to it from exactly where I am. So I got to tell you the truth. I got to be real right in this moment. My state of mind first before I talk about the rest of us. I'm tired. So I'm really tired. And part of it, so I want to talk about that. So part of it might be labeled traditionally as women's stuff. And I mean women broadly defined, right? I wrote here, I've come to appreciate how fluid the term woman has always been and the freedom that fluidity gives us all. So I want to say that too. But I'm talking about, I'm at an age where my body betrays me. Sleep can be elusive. The last 2 weeks, for some reason, I haven't been sleeping much at all. My brain feels a little fuzzy. I get up and look in the mirror and I'm like, who dat? You know, I hope, can you sign it? Right, exactly, who dat, right? I don't recognize myself as I get older. I'm in a kind of denial a little bit about how old I am and where I'm at right now and what are the limitations of my body. I spend a lot of time thinking about the mental gymnastics that I have to do to get out of my own way, the emotional and the mental gymnastics in order to show up at this moment and do what I need to do. And that seems to be a lifelong thing. I call it doing my Simone Biles thing, you know, the very badass gymnastic star. How do I do that in my own head? But I'm also tired, particularly since last summer, when George Floyd was murdered, when Christian Cooper walked into a park, had his skin weaponized against him, when Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep, and the list goes on, right? I've been tired about all that for a really long time, but there's something since last June that has made it front and center in such a very particular way. And I realize I'm tired, as I imagine many of you are as well. And I think about that, you know, and I wrote here, I've become a Jane of all traits when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, race and the environment, power and privilege, land and belonging, erasure and invisibility in our environmental stories, speaking, consulting, writing, educating, advising, you know. And then I was thinking, but you know how we all roll, right? Because that's how we roll. We're Jane of all traits. We come to it as we will. And then I'm reminded of something Teresa Baker always tells me, just when I'm starting to feel just a little bit sorry for myself because I'm so tired. Teresa will remind me of how our ancestors rolled. When Sojourner Truth was saying, look at me, look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. No man could head me. And ain't I a woman? So I've been thinking about that. And Sojourner wasn't talking in a metaphor, right? When she was talking about her arms and plowing and planting. So then I come correct again, thinking about that for myself. I have to check myself. And what's the work I have to do on the regular to be able to do this work in this moment, in terms of what this moment calls us all to do? How do I play the long game? And I always start with myself because I want to make no assumption about everybody out there, everybody that I can't see. And I don't want to make any assumption that anybody out there isn't already showing up as they need to all the time. But I just kind of want to tell you where I'm at and what I kind of struggle with on the daily. So I've been thinking about how this is the long game and what do I mean by that? And I think it's always been the long game ever since Christopher Columbus got lost and we've been trying to find our way, right? Because he got lost, right? And then for some reason, which we don't have time to talk about, his point of view, his experience of the world became centered. And it became our experience of the world. It became the narrative that we have continued to promote for 450, 500 years, despite all the people that were already here before, diverse, experienced, living fully in relationship to the land. Right? I've been thinking about the long game in terms of the work that we have to do: acknowledgement, truth-telling, holding to account, making visible, reconnecting, reconciliation, digging deep, plowing and planting, to borrow Sojourner's words. And we have to set intentions. And those of you who've heard me talk, I'm always saying this. And I know that organizations and institutions talk about aspiration and vision, and that's really important. I get that. And I want to know, what are the intentions that you create that you are going to be in service to be in service to that aspiration? How are you going to practice what it is that you preach? What does that look like on the ground? And what are you willing to do to get there? You know, How are you going to keep it real? What are you willing to risk? What are we willing to risk? What am I willing to risk? And as others have heard me say over and over again, this isn't about a risk because you're afraid of losing something, but what are you willing to risk in order to gain something? So one of the other things I've been thinking about, I'm thinking about it a lot for years, but particularly in the last couple of months, is the issue of representation. Something Jay Lynn pointed to, and I'm sure many of you over the past 3 days have pointed to, who we see, whose stories we tell, who gets to tell the stories, who gets to decide, what that vision is, what that intention is, and what gets left out. A couple of weeks ago, I read an article in the Paris Review, and the article was by an African-American writer. Her name is Mara Cheeks, and it's entitled, "Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted?" And in it, she talks a little bit about the Jewish writer and public speaker, Fran Lebowitz. And here's what Fran Lebowitz says about books. She asked the question, why does everyone want to see themselves in books? A book is not supposed to be a mirror. It's supposed to be a door, right? So Maura Cheeks writes, quote, "I understand the sentiment, but I disagree with the argument. It's the type of sentiment that can only be felt by someone who was unknowingly represented almost everywhere she turned. She didn't know what she had." Later on in the article, Fran Lebowitz is in conversation with the African-American late great writer Toni Morrison, and the conversation comes up again. And Fran Lebowitz says to Toni Morrison, "Your other readers aren't you." And Morrison says, "Yes, they are." And I've been thinking about that. And she laughed. She wasn't arguing with her. She's saying, yes, they are. To understand that for some of us, we haven't lived a life of having ourselves reflected in such a way and seen in such a way that counts for something more than simply our individual lives. And so there's a responsibility there and an accountability there, not just because we want to talk about ourselves, not just because I want to talk about myself, but I want to invite the possibility that the stories we've been telling are missing something. And when they miss something for us all. I'm looking down at my notes because I was saying who was doing the telling, who was doing the writing, who was setting the terms. That really matters, and it's always mattered. I've been thinking about that when we talk about Thoreau and Muir and the dominant environment and all the dominant environmental narrative and all the voices and experiences that have defined a set of practices and memories of who we are as human beings and as Americans in relationship to non-human nature, and how we grow that relationship and what that relationship is supposed to look like and how we regulate and legislate that relationship. And if you operate outside of that relationship, there's something wrong. You are invalidated, discounted, erased, ignored, dismissed, diminished. We have done it for over 450 years. And sometimes we do it unintentionally. We don't even know we're doing it because that's what privilege looks like, right? I always say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. And everyone is biased, everyone, including me, which means people in a position of power like Muir and Thoreau and others who are also thoughtful people in many ways, right, are also doing the same, discounting the experience of others who look different from themselves. Earlier, when I was being introduced by Michelle, and she talked about the 5 years I spent backpacking in Africa and Asia, which really, really did change the course of my life. The motivation was kind of different. I thought I was saving a marriage. Who does that, by the way? Most people just go to therapy. It didn't save the marriage, but changed the way that I saw myself in the world. I was obsessed with travel adventure books. I loved reading anyway, but I was obsessed. I would hit every bookstore and go to the travel adventure section. I wanted to read about every type of person who did everything: climb mountains, cross rivers, sail around the world, cross deserts, whatever it was. People from the 1800s, people from the 1900s. It didn't matter. I was just interested in everybody. And in all the reading I did of amazing men and women who define themselves as men or women in a more traditional sense, there was never anybody who looked like me. And I wondered about that. I said, I know I'm not the first person to do this, like to hike in Nepal or, traverse across parts of East Africa. I know I'm not. My ego might like to think I am, but I know that that's not true. And I found not only was I not confirmed or considered, but you could not get to know me. And what does that mean for how we move forward together? What does it mean when we cannot get to know someone who is different from ourselves? What gets lost in translation as we move forward and have conversations about sustainability? And what I always ask, what is it that we are trying to sustain? Excuse me. I've also been talking a lot about the baby in the bathwater. I tend to use some really bad metaphors, but I just can't let go of them, so I apologize. In about 2008, 2009, that was when I was teaching at UC Berkeley. I was there for about 8 years. And in my early days of being there, President Clinton was invited to come to campus and speak. And so, I had never seen him in person speak. And I will say the man is an amazing orator. And he said a lot of things with just a handful of index cards. He just could rattle the stuff off. But the thing that really hit me was when he said the challenge for developing countries is their infrastructure. They have to work on strengthening their infrastructure. But for countries like the United States, our biggest challenge is the rigidity of our institutions. Oh, and I wrote that down. I was like, whoa, that is the thing that stuck with me. The rigidity of our institutions, our political, our academic, all the environmental institutions, the government agencies. I mean, everything across the board. When I think about how many of these institutions, if not almost all of them, let me just say it, I'm just going to be big with it, were created at a time where anybody who looked like me or looked like Jaylyn or looked like a lot of people, Leah, the interpreter, a lot of people on this call would not have been invited into. Not only would we have not been invited, our information might have been transacted, extracted, appropriated, rewritten, erased, ignored, dismissed, diminished, right? The institutions were often created in that way, which isn't to say that the institutions didn't also do some good work. I think one of our biggest challenges here in this country is addressing the complexity of who we've always been. We are complicated. We are complex. The conversation about what's good and bad for me has never been useful. Because I don't know about you, but I sure been bad sometimes. Even if my intention is to do good. And how do we hold that complexity in a way that invites all of us into the circle to consider how we might move forward together? And what needs to be overhauled with institutions? For me, one of the issues with institutions and organizations of any type is our framing of this center. There's always a center, right? The center to the margins. We talk about people who look like some of us in this conference today as being marginalized. And I understand, with deep respect to bell hooks and others who have understood that framing and what's dangerous about it. And I want to offer that we actually throw that out, because part of what is centered, for me, this is what white supremacy means. I always say, whiteness is not a bad thing. Nobody can help the skin they were born in. Whiteness is diverse, just like any other color and way of showing up in the world. It's complicated. But what we have done in this country is center whiteness in a very particular way. We have used universal terms to describe who we are as a collective from that perspective of whiteness, which has forced the rest of us either to resist, assimilate, negotiate, duck and weave. It's constant. It's all the time. Because at the heart, what I believe most of us want as human beings is to be accepted, is to belong, is to be whole, is to be free. And what's the price that we have to pay for that? And believe me, we are all not paying the same price. We have all never paid the same price. So how do we change that and have a different kind of conversation and a different kind of model? Can we think of a web of relationships? What might that open up? How does that make us all accountable in relationship to each other? And what is the work we each have to do to be able to stand in a very particular way in relationship in that way? So what I always say, I want to be back to the bad metaphor, baby in the bathwater. And I like to say we don't have to throw out the baby in the bathwater, because with respect to people who have worked hard, who have given their life over to certain institutions and organizations, to a certain kind of rigor and discipline, I don't believe in throwing anybody out. I know that's not the way we've always operated in this country, that we think some people can just be thrown away. I don't believe we have to replicate that in any form. But if we're saying we want change and we want to do something different, I do believe we have to get rid of the bathtub. Change is also about loss. I think change is also about destruction. You know, we love to talk about rebirth, and I want to challenge us to think about what that destruction, that breaking down in order to break through looks like. How do we do that together? What does that leap of faith look like to do that work, where nobody gets left out? So here I want to talk about the idea of redemption, right? Because for me, this is, you know, I can only call this stuff for me, right? What's on my mind and how I want to show up in the world. What's that thing Sojourner said? I want to say it again. Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? I want to talk about Amy Cooper. You know, Amy Cooper. She was, you know, in that story of Christian Cooper, the self-identified gay Black man, a birder, who was out, you know, looking at birds one early morning in New York City in a park. And Amy Cooper, self-identified white woman, you know, when Christian Cooper asked her to put her dog on a leash, because that's what the sign said, what she did was take her phone and say, I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African-American man is threatening me. She did not say, I'm going to call and tell them that a person is threatening me, that a man is threatening me. She said an African-American man is threatening me. Now, later on, I read how she talked about being progressive, a Democrat, like that's not who she is. And for me, there's something in the moment, in her consciousness, that was there. And while I hope to meet Christian Cooper and that we engage in conversation, I got to tell you, the conversation I want to have is with Amy Cooper. I'm gonna come back to it. I'm gonna hold that for a minute. Why? I'll explain it. Okay, so I want to talk about Alice Walker's book, A Color Purple. So when that book came out, I think it was 1980. My Aunt Bert gave me that book, and I was, as a kid, as a teenager, I was also, and in my 20s, I loved to read. When she gave me that book, I was floored. Actually, I didn't know how to read the book, because the book started and focused on, I believe the primary character was a 13-year-old Black girl who had no formal education. And it centered the story on her point of view. I remember that actually I couldn't just read through the story. I started to read it and my brain didn't know how to engage that writing. And I had to set it down in order to come back, because I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, she's the center of the book is starting with her. Wait, what's happening right now? So Alice Walker became one of my favorite writers and somebody who shaped the way that I think about myself and the world and think about the world in general. And a number of years later, in the 90s, I believe it was, Steven Spielberg decided to take A Color Purple and make it into a movie. Now, for anybody out there who hasn't read the book or seen the movie, it's the story that sort of centers on Black life, and in particular, Black women, you know, in the time of, you know, just after slavery, you know, Jim Crow's in place. So all the challenges of what it was like to live as Black women at that time and as Black people at that time in the United States. Also a part of the story is a primary character of a Black man. His name was Mr. In the movie, the character was played by Danny Glover. And Mr. beats women. He beats women. He takes them when he wants. That's the character. It's pretty brutal. And in the story and in the movie, and in the movie, it's really visible in a way that, it's not in a book, right? So you're seeing this happen. When the movie came out, Alice Walker talked about in a later book how depressed she ended up being for 3 years because the most hate mail she said she got was from Black people. And they wrote in because they said, oh my God, basically, you put that in the story, you demonized the Black man, why did you do that, et cetera, et cetera. And she talked about how it just broke her heart because she loved Black people. That was her, one of her primary motivations to tell this story. She loved Black people and how long it took her to overcome that and work through that over the course of the next 3 years. In 2005, I was living in Atlanta and I was working on Black Faces, White Spaces as a dissertation. And my friend, Black writer extraordinaire Valerie Boyd, who was the only Black biographer, by the way, of Zora Neale Hurston, had gotten an invitation from Alice Walker to go to New York and see The Color Purple on Broadway. Oprah was presenting it, and Valerie was invited to come for opening night. And Valerie invited me, and I forgot about the dissertation. I was like, yes, I'm definitely going. And as we sat in the audience at the end of the show, Oprah got on stage and wonderfully said, talked about, what this meant to her and her time making A Color Purple. And then she invited Alice Walker on stage. And the cast was standing behind her. And Alice Walker looked out at the audience and said, one of the very first things she said was, this is a story about redemption. To understand that she did not diminish or ignore the things that the character Mr. had done to the women. But the beauty of the story was actually the end. You had to get to the end, right? Because that was when the women invited him back into the flock. He was held accountable, absolutely 100%. But there was a larger intention there of him being invited back, the chance to redeem himself, to be something more, to be something better, to be in different relationship. And everybody gains from that. That is the power. When I was a kid, my father, I grew up in what I like to call a Black power household. My parents had a high school education. My father was an angry Black man, and he still is. He only has dementia now, so it comes out in strange ways. But he was angry. He was angry about the experience he had growing up in the South. And he often put that on his family in very particular ways. But one of the things that he always said to me is, you have to read Malcolm X. He considered himself more of a Malcolm X man than he did a Martin Luther King man. And because he told me that I needed to read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I didn't read it because, I was a kid. And I was like, well, since you're telling me to read it, I'm not going to. I didn't read the autobiography of Malcolm X until I lived in Nepal. I was 32. And I was just reading everything at this point. That also changed my life because oftentimes Malcolm X, what's emphasized is all the anger, that he felt, that he spoke. But if you read the story all the way through of his experience right before he was assassinated, he talks about being for all the people, no matter who they are, for human beings. He comes right to that point. And I was blown away. That's when I was blown away by who he was, is the journey that he had to go through to get there. And had he lived, what might have happened, what we might have all been gifted with, that journey, right? That like all of us, he's not static. The anger is real. The hurt is real. The resistance is real. But so is the love and the desire and the potential and the humanity. And what I always say, how do we do this work, hold people accountable, and yet never deny anybody their humanity and the chance to be redeemed? And what is the work we have to do to make that right? So that's why I want to have the conversation with Amy Cooper, because you know what? She has held it for everybody else. We made her the scapegoat for all the wrongs for 450 years. And I want to ask everyone, and what have we gained? I'm not saying she shouldn't be held accountable. I'm the first to tell her. Christian Cooper, and I want to meet Christian Cooper, but I have Christian Cooper stories for myself. I know what that feels like on the regular. But what I want to understand is what it feels like for Amy Cooper right now, and what becomes possible, and how that might turn into a learning, into a teaching for others like herself. That it doesn't shrink up and shrivel and become something nasty and ugly and shut down. How can it become something else? I got emotional and then I lost my way. Okay. So the last story I want to say, and then I want to open it up into conversation with everyone, is I want to go back to the long game. An article that I wrote recently, I am a columnist for the Earth Island Journal. I'm happy to be a columnist for them. And I just wrote the first column, and I had to introduce myself to everybody. And I was thinking about this. And the week that I started writing this was right after January 6th, right? So like a lot of people, I was glued for days to the TV, right? And then we had the inauguration for like 10 hours straight. I watched. And I'm not trying to be political here so much as to say this side or that side or about division. I'm just trying to be real with where I was at and what I was doing and watching it and how it made me feel. And the point in the inauguration that actually was the most powerful for me, aside from the amazing Amanda Gorman, was actually when Roy Blount, the Republican senator from Missouri, presented then the newly minted president, Joe Biden, with a painting called Landscape with Rainbow. And it was painted by the African-American painter, Robert S. Duncanson, in 1859. And I basically didn't hear anything else for a while because I was writing everything down. I was looking up. I said, who is Robert S. Duncanson? What is happening right now with this painting? A Black man did a painting with a rainbow in 1859, And the reason it struck me was because at first the landscape looked like a lot of other landscapes from well-known painters of European ancestry at that time that would paint, the American landscape in this sort of vast and imaginative sort of way. I mean, it's the way they kind of told that narrative. It was also that he put a rainbow in there, and rainbows are about promise and possibility, and it's symbolic. And I said, how was that man feeling that in 1859? Because slavery was in place. He wasn't enslaved. But I read about that he suffered from a lot of mental health issues because of prejudice. I read that he would go, I guess, back and forth to Canada, because maybe it was a bit better up there than it was down here. That he was holding that while trying to live his life as a whole person. He was of European and African ancestry. But you know how we were in this country, the one drop rule. I'm just going to say it, right? He was a Black man in a Black body at a time when we held Black bodies as property to labor on the land for free, to build the economic backbone of this country. I can't imagine what it was like to hold that at that moment and still paint a landscape with a rainbow. And the thing I came to for myself to understand and wrap my head around it was that he was playing the long game. Because exactly 100 years later, in 1959, I was born. And that's where I became possible, along with a lot of other people who look like me and some who don't look like me as well. In 7th grade, I lived in Mamaroneck. I went to public school there. I went to the Mamaroneck High School, but I also got to go to junior high, and there was a junior high school called Homix, and there was a lot of resources in this neighborhood. So the schools had a lot of educational resources. So I was privileged to have my experience there. And in 7th grade, I found out that I was going to be awarded a medal from the Daughters of the American Revolution. which is a conservative group of women who focus on patriotism, and they can, if I understand it properly, they can, chart their lineage all the way back. I had been a Brownie, a Girl Scout, even a cadet, and I did a lot of volunteer stuff. I had a very simplistic understanding of what it meant to do good in the world, and my parents kind of pushed me in that way, and which I'm really glad they did. But when I found out that I was going to get a medal, I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting, because my parents were like, oh, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Because my father's like, I don't know what they're going to think, but let's go to the ceremony at the school now. And I say, picture me, I had my afro, right? And it was a predominantly white school. You had a handful of African-American families. Some, like mine, were working class. And there I was sitting in the audience, and I remember my name being called. Now, I wrote this in the article, and I said, my name is Carolyn Finney. And when I was that age, oftentimes if white friends would invite me over to their house, parents would be surprised to see someone who looks like me, because they thought I'd be Irish. And I even remember one person's parents saying, oh my God, I thought you'd have red hair and freckles. They weren't trying to insult me. They just were kind of surprised by this is what they saw instead. So when my name was called and I had to go up and accept my medal from these women, these white women were sitting at a table, they looked stern. They were not smiling. And I really recognized that look on their face, that look of like, this is not who we were expecting, but we've got to give her the medal. That's how I received it. So I got my medal and walked back. And I remember feeling uncomfortable the way you are. I was a kid, I was 13, 14. I was also a little angry. I felt a little righteous at it, because I was also like, you know what? Democracy is my dream too. I'm here too. So I want to come back to this idea of the long game and thinking about there's no end game here. For me, it is how we are going to continually show up, how we're going to continually keep swinging. The last thing I want to say, and the last word, and this is a very small anecdote, is maybe 6 years ago, I was standing in SFO in the airport, and the flight was delayed. And you know how you're standing in line to board, and when you find out the flight's delayed, everybody starts talking to everybody. And I was standing behind a South Asian woman who looked younger than me, but it was hard to tell, but she was shorter in stature. She was just shorter in terms of her height, and two white women around the same age as me standing behind me. And we all started talking like, oh, I wonder how long we're going to be standing here. And it suddenly got to the conversation of what do each of us do? And the South Asian woman, not with a smile on her face, but she was open. She said, I've been to 75 countries. I go around the world talking with businesses about diversity. And she didn't crack a smile. She wasn't trying to be friendly about it, but she said, this is what I do. And I want to quote her exactly. She said, empathy and sympathy are nice, but who do you stand with? That shook me, and I still think about it. It shook me for days after that. It's like, who do I stand with? And what does that look like? So I want to end there by saying that I stand with you. Yeah, so let's do this. I always have more to say, but I'm stopping there.
Wow. So watching you for a moment, change is coming from people like you, Dr. Finney. Thank you.
Change is coming from people like us, Michelle.
True, I know. But I just mean the storytelling. One of the things I wrote down as you were speaking was this accountability, this web of relationships, this long game. And I've listened to a lot of your talks, and it dawned on me that you use individual stories of a person, and you don't demonize that person. And then you scroll out to this big picture of the context and the environment. And we can focus on a person all day long, but unless we get to the context and the environment, those are just individual stories. And so I really encourage everyone who's listening today to go to the internet and listen to many of your talks, because these stories all come back to the greater context. And it's just important for all of us to not focus on the news story of the day, but the larger piece of it that's happening and how we get together. So that's why I'm just so grateful to listen to you today. And we have
can I just add to that and say that in that I also choose the individual stories is to remind myself of the humanity embedded in all of us, right? That we're all going to make mistakes. It's just going to happen. I'm going to do it. You're going to do it if we haven't already done it, and we'll probably do it again, you know? And how do we show up? And that while we're spiraling back out to that bigger story, we're also creating that story. And for me, it's an invitation. It means that I'm invited in to be part of that larger story, which is why I feel the need to always put it out there that way. Does that make sense, Michelle?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And for those listening, I listened to the one talk that she did at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. It's about 40 minutes. And you tell the story of your life as well. And it's just fabulous to hear about how much you have done to arrive with this type of perspective woven in with all of the academic knowledge that you have. So it's just, it's overwhelmingly. And so I'm going to get to the questions that people have. So we have an anonymous person who's attending, and that person said, you took 5 years to backpack and learn about people in Asia and Africa. What is your preferred way to learn about different people and cultures now?
Woo! That's a great question. Well, I should say that through the work. Isn't that weird? I love to travel, and you know, I live by myself here in Burlington. It's been a really challenging year, as it has for most of us, if not all of us, in different ways. So I don't want to discount anyone's experience. I will say that for me, I usually get on a plane every week before that, and I'm out with, you know, doing this work with people. It's been really challenging not to have that breath-to-breath contact with people, even though I'm working way more than I ever had all day long, right here in this box on computer. I like to travel in that way in part. I like airports. I mean, that's really, I know that's odd. I've been telling people I miss Chicago O'Hare, but part of it is I like to watch people and engage with people and have a sense of who I am in connection with people. You know, the idea of web of relationships for me becomes more real when I'm in the life with everyone. There's also a sense of, you know, I was thinking back to Jalen's land acknowledgement and talking to us about the indigenous presence that is always here and always has been, and what I continue to learn from that history about the way we have, I think, in Western education, separated ourselves from nature. We even talk about it like humans and nature. And I try really hard to break that, because we are part of nature. The ecosystem includes us, as my friend and thinker and artist Kaylin Tutrees says, you know, we are just a detail on the landscape, which isn't to diminish any of us as individuals and the power and potential of our individual lives. But when we become a detail and not the people controlling and defining the landscape, what changes? You know, how do we open up there? So my preferred way, oh my God, is being breath to breath with people, however that is. I'm privileged to be able to make my living doing this work. And I love that, talking with people, talking to people, engaging in conversation. Writing is kind of secondary. I love to use my mouth, you know, talk, and everybody who knows me, but I like to communicate in that way, but also through writing and moving through the world. There's something about mobility, and having that mobility that I don't take for granted. And I am close to the magic that way when I move. There's something about feeling free. I don't take freedom for granted on many, many levels, whether it's because I think about some of my ancestors, if I think about my parents who adopted me, if I think about myself, you know, in different institutions, and, you know, often what we're asked to do, and how often we have to make a choice between things. I think we should never have to be able to make a choice between, right, what's ethically and morally correct. And sometimes that comes up with what is the law or how we keep our job. And so there's something about being out in the world and moving through it, which helps me be closer to not only who you are, but who I am as well.
Awesome. The second question that came up was also from an anonymous person. We had a workshop session yesterday about telling your own environmental story. What advice do you have for everyone listening to tap into their own And how can we pay attention within our own stories to opportunities for destruction and redemption?
Oh, I love that question. So yes. So this is, when I teach, I'm doing a part-time residency at Middlebury College in the Franklin Environmental Center. And I teach one class, it's a non-traditional class. And I always ask the students to write an environmental autobiography, their very first assignment. And I said, it's the easiest day you'll ever get, 3 to 5 pages, whatever you want to talk about. But it's getting a sense of where you stand and your own bias and your own experience, not to devalue it or dismiss it, just talk about it. Your grandparents, that place you went camping, whatever it is you want to say, that farm, doesn't matter, to talk about that story. And I do that, in part is to always make sure that you understand where it is you stand. So no matter how you come to this subject broadly defined, you're clear, that whole saying, know thyself, like you know thyself. I'm not asking you to make an excuse for it, but I think bias can tip over sometimes into prejudice and racism if we don't have a clear sense of understanding our own limitations. I didn't tell my story today because I tell it all the time and I didn't want to take up the time with it. But the reason I do isn't simply to bring myself in the room, but to offer it as an invitation for everybody to bring themselves also into the room. And also because, like Toni Morrison, I'm also the audience as well as the speaker. I feel that for myself. I want to say, and I have to, since you asked me that question, this is how, in terms of destruction and change, the motivation for me to do this work, and I've always said this, is personal, it's political, and it's intimate. The shift, it wasn't simply a dissertation opportunity. Actually, it only became a dissertation opportunity because what was happening with my parents, where they cared for this land, this 12-acre estate for 50 years, that wasn't theirs, and had to leave it, which meant that none of us, me and my brothers, we could never go home again to this place. And there's a longer story there. But while my parents were still living on that land, my father had given my mother a weeping cherry tree for their 40th wedding anniversary. It's a beautiful tree. And when they had to leave, they couldn't take that tree with them. But when they moved to Leesburg, Virginia, they bought another one and they planted it. They didn't have all that land anymore. They lived on a 1/2 acre of land. Well, many of you, if you've heard me talk before, I usually start off with that story to ground myself in a very particular way. This is the point of view I come from, asking questions, around public lands and who is the public and who gets access. And when a conservation easement got placed on that estate, the land trust, sent a letter out to everybody in the neighborhood and let them know why. There were pictures of the estate, talked about where it sat in the watershed, the wildlife on the property, all the reasons it should be protected. And at the end of the letter, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. And he'd been on the land, 3, 5, 6 years at that time. But what surprised me when I looked at the letter was there was nothing mentioning my parents who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years. And just that fast, they got erased. So also part of my motivation was just like that erasure and all the other people in this country who've been erased as though we don't exist, that our labor, our love, the relationships we have no value. And instead, we are often assimilated, outreached to, expected to engage in a very particular way, as though we don't have any embodied knowledge of that history and our own past. And some of that past ain't that long ago. So I'm telling you all this because one of the things that has happened this year, and when you know your story and put it out there, I'm just saying magic is possible. In 2019, in the before times when we were still flying around, I was speaking at the Telluride Film Festival, and there were like 1,000 people in the audience, and there were a whole bunch of us speaking, but I had my story up on screen, and I was telling all that. There were filmmakers and stuff in the audience, most who I never met. This last summer, a woman named Irene Taylor, who had won Emmys, had been Oscar nominated, she's this white woman who's a documentary film director, reached out to me. We had a Zoom call, and she said, I saw you. She goes, I'm doing this HBO documentary on trees, and I want to talk about each tree that I choose in a relationship to people. So there's this kind of story. And I realized I have no Black people up in here. And I said, well, you could talk about African Americans and lynching, but she says, I'm not the person to do that. And I said, and we're really not just the bad things that happened to us. And so I told the story about the cherry blossom tree, my parents, to give her an example about how you can think differently. She liked the story so much. she decided that she's going to tell that story of my family on the estate. And so we've sent her old movie videos and all. There's this archivist who's digging into the background of the states into the 1800s. We're trying to just tell a fuller story of that land, as well as my family, as well as the conversation around race, and very particularly African Americans. As though that wasn't enough, the New York Botanical Gardens, at another major institution, right, reached out and said, we'd love to have you do a residency here. And I told them the story. I don't remember how it came up, the cherry blossom tree. And they said, you know what? We're the New York Botanical Gardens. I bet you we could build a relationship with the land trust, get access to the estate, get a sampling of that cherry tree, bring it back to the New York Botanical Gardens and tell a story. And I got emotional when they told me, because I was like, what is happening? And I said, that would be incredible. Well, I want to roll ahead a little bit to last December. The land trust also agreed. So we got the land trust on board. But the land trust went on the estate at the end of December. And I had sent them a picture of where the tree is, and they sent me back a picture. It all had been landscaped. The tree was gone. Because now there's brand new owners who are 2 owners removed from the owners who knew my family, who knew about the tree. So they didn't know about the tree, right? And the meaning it had. And for a few days, we were all devastated. And I know my parents aren't listening, because I haven't told them yet. So I know they're not listening to this. So, and then I kind of woke up going, wait a minute, this is the truer story of what happens in this country around land and environment and place and story. This is the story we should be telling. Irene Taylor took it and ran. She was like, yes, this is the story we should be telling. So now what we have is an award-winning documentary filmmaker that has access, that she's decided she's not going to focus globally anymore on the story of trees and people. She's going to focus on North America and tell just 4 stories, because there's big stories to be told here. One of them being what happened to my family. The New York Botanical Gardens and the Land Trust are saying, okay, yes, let's see what we can do here. And as of late, the owner, because we've been trying to reach out to the new owners for months, has finally reached back and said they're open for conversation. So what I'm hoping for, even beyond this, is that not only to have access to the estate, but what would happen if she would let me replant a tree? And everyone is accountable. So now, the new owners, the land trust, the botanical gardens, the filmmaker, the Black person, the family, we're working together, because I'm not interested in shaming anybody. I'm really, really not. And understanding things happen, and I was angry, like, let me be clear. And this is the opportunity I'm interested in. How do we get everybody to say, okay, the owners have a power I don't have? They own the land. They can say, yes. The land trust has power I don't have. They can be responsible for protecting that on that property along with everything else. The New York Botanical Gardens tell stories of all types around flora. They have a power I don't have. And my family, we own the story. So that's the power we do have. And what's the magic that comes together? So that's the thing. What your stories might uncover. I could have never told you this. I could have never guessed it. Back in 2003, when this was happening to my parents, we had to leave the land. I had no idea. But I've understood from others, particularly Black writers and others who've said we are our own memory keepers, poets like Carolyn Finney and others who said we have to tell our story. We can't be waiting for other people to tell our stories. This is also the plowing and planting I believe Sojourner might have been pointing to. And this we can do. And I don't think we always have to do it alone. So I hope that makes sense.
Wow. You know, as you were talking about this web of accountability and some of the things we've talked about today and yesterday, you just embodied. One is you have an amazing network and you used it for good, number one. Number two, that history and what people bring is part of what people want to believe in. They want to have a why. And then third was not being quiet, that you just didn't let it go. And so that web of accountability that you just described and that we all learn from now is just an amazing story. We're so grateful.
Thank you. And I want to say, and people know this, and so I won't go into it, that the risk is always true. I mean, I believe that I lost a job because I held to that. There are a lot of opportunities I also did not get because I held to that in a very particular way. And this is what I mean about, you have to decide for yourself what that risks look like. Are you supported to be able to do that? What is the self-care you need to be able to continue to do that? I'm sure many of you are already doing that. What drives you? I know Teresa gets on me all the time about, like, you need to rest. And then she asks me to do the next thing, right? And because there's always a next thing. And I actually thrive in this space in a very particular way. I tell people that for all the emotion that I feel all the time, I'm so incredibly optimistic because I've never seen it like this in my life. I've never seen the door open. I've never seen my inboxes are overflowing with requests, and I feel a way about it. I feel a lot of ways about it. And one of the ways about it I feel is I'm being called. I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm incredibly grateful. There are people who've lost their job. There are people who are dying. There are people who don't have any money. There are people who continue to die because of their difference. Right? Who am I to say no and not show up in the best way possible and risk whatever? The other thing I want to say, and people have heard me say that, is a friend of mine, artist, she's a Black artist named Marguerite Brown, who's in her late 70s, who lives in the Bay Area. When I was struggling with some stuff back in it was around 2011, 2012, challenges, right, with some institutions around who I was and how I show up, she said to me, when you're doing something different, when you're out there on the edge, when you're in the front lines, I said, yeah, you're going to sometimes get arrows in your ass. And I kind of paused for a second, then I just laughed. I was like, oh, that's true, isn't it? So what I've been saying lately, so you just have to wear better padding. It's like to expect that it's going to be comfortable or to even hope for that, I actually think is a waste of energy. I think that that's part of what this moment calls us for. It's like, I'm just going to wear thicker padding because I know I'm not out there by myself. And I think that the magic that's where the magic happens. That's where what is going to emerge has a chance to emerge because you put yourself out there. And you didn't put yourself out there always alone, which is why I'm real big on relationship. I know, Michelle, you said I have a network, and I appreciate that. And I'm really careful to think of it as a set of relationships because I do not want it to be simply a transaction between me and someone else, regardless of how powerful they may or may not be. And I don't always get it right, but I'm thinking about it in terms of relationship.
Awesome. Well, we are inspired today. We all have something that we can think about, and how can we contribute? How can we get a pair of heavier panties so that when those arrows come, that's a great takeaway. I will mention to everyone that this was recorded. You can watch it again and again. Please pass it along on your social media as well. It will be on the Summit's YouTube channel forever. And we want to thank Teresa, Jam Collective, Ravel Media, the sponsors, which include Backcountry, and that this event is free, and all proceeds go to the Karin Project. We'd also like to remind you to tune into the episode of She Explores podcast, which will highlight speakers and panelists from the summit. And if you have any questions or feedback or comments, to please contact the event organizers. And let's just please say thank you to everyone who put this event together. I mean, it was an enormous amount of work. Can't tell you how much we're all grateful to you. So thank you.